Good morning. My name is Khalid Bachkar. I'm a college professor at California Maritime Academy and International Business and Logistics. I will be moderating this panel discussion today. This is Accidents on the Bay, Environmental and Economic Implication to Job Growth. In fact, according to Gatrick, there are several basic aspects of maritime activity that make it unique. Ships are confined and isolated systems, self-sufficient on energy supply. They have limited manpower and resources, and they have limited response to face emergencies. These particular characteristics made maritime trade a risky activity, where a fault in navigations or unusual port operation can give rise to injuries or loss of life, to damage of property, and sometimes irreparable damage to maritime environment. Although risk inherent to maritime industry cannot be completely removed, it can be reduced to acceptable levels through the use of risk management principles. US Department of Transportation and the UK P&I Club identified human errors as a cause of 60 to 80% of maritime accidents. So despite the significant advances that have been achieved in the San Francisco Bay and Delta, in the field of maritime technology, the number of maritime accidents has not been reduced significantly. In fact, maritime activity is a risky activity, and maritime disaster that had happened through the years and which will happen in an unavoidable way are due to the complex environment of ship operation. Although maritime transport has a relatively low death and injury rate, the consequences of an accident happening are sometimes far-reaching. The repercussions of oil pollution or large loss of life in the passengers carrying vessels can last for many years and take their toll on businesses, small economies, and even government. So in this regard, the San Francisco Bay and Delta is a highway in the water, and an accident can have enormous environmental consequences and economic implications to thousands of jobs. There are many questions that we have to answer today. Some of it will be, are we doing enough to protect the Bay and Delta? And what might we need to differently minimize an accident and protect our economic resources, trade, and environment? So to answer those questions, we have invited 5 speakers, and we prearranged how they can speak. So the first one will be Guy Bjerke from Western States Petroleum Associations, and the second one is John Burge from Pacific Merchant Shipping Associations, and the third is Captain Peter McIsaac from San Francisco Bar Pilots, and the fourth is Commander Jason Tama from U.S. Coast Guard, and lastly, and not the least, is Yvonne Addassi from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Office of Spill Prevention and Response. So I will give you a short introduction of the first speaker, which is Guy Bjerke. Okay.
That was an extremely short, no, thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank the Bay Planning Coalition for the invitation to present today. The Western States Petroleum Association represents the petroleum industry in 6 western states. We have 28 members, and for the most part, they're the major producers, refiners, transporters, marketers of oil, natural gas, and other petroleum products in those states. My role on this panel is to present just a sampling of the economic importance of the commerce transported on the bay as represented by the petroleum industry. The complete impact of shipping on our local economy is even greater and growing. In your program on pages 10 and 11, you have an outline of the economic impacts that commerce on the bay brings to us. I have some actual updated numbers on the petroleum sector, so I want to give those to you. In the Bay Area, the petroleum industry is directly and indirectly responsible for creating about 97,000 jobs and about $10.7 billion per year in annual labor income. We're also responsible for about $1.3 billion per year in state and federal tax revenues. Now, to fully appreciate why the San Francisco Bay plays a critical role in the delivery of energy to our region and the state, let me give you a little background. California consumers use about 2 million gallons of gasoline and diesel per hour. 2 million gallons of gasoline or diesel per hour. To make all that fuel, California refineries use about 2 million barrels of oil per day. About 783,000 barrels of those barrels, or 40%, are refined in the Bay Area's 5 refineries. But California only produces about 580,000 barrels per day. So about 60% of what we use comes from somewhere else. And there are no pipelines connecting California to other regions in North America that produce and supply crude oil products, making California effectively a petroleum island. The only way to keep California's energy needs satisfied and our economy moving today is to import crude oil delivered by tanker. In the San Francisco Bay, those deliveries are hampered when shipping channels silt up and the prudent draft depths of tankers require shipping with less than optimum loads. In the future, under current policies to implement AB 32 and the low carbon fuel standard, it is also possible that we will see increased shipments of imported alternative fuel blending stocks like sugar or cellulosic ethanol. That means as our need for energy grows, so will the number of tanker trips to supply that demand. We can work to minimize the number of tanker trips and their associated impact on the bay with a focused dredging policy and a commitment to channel deepening where appropriate. But regardless of how well we dredge our ship channels, the safe navigation of commerce on the bay is crucial to the future success of our local economy and a priority for our business community. That's why we have worked for so many years with the other organizations on this panel, the experts, on practical and cost-effective ways to improve safe shipping and protect the environment. I look forward to hearing their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. It was a good presentation. Our next speaker will be John Birch, and John is a vice president with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. John?
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you to John Coleman and the Bay Planning Coalition for inviting me here today. The title of my presentation, and let's see if we can, right there, thank you. It's Accidents on the Bay, Actions and Reactions. Now, Newton's third law of motion, if you recall, says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, for every significant incident on the bay, we usually see a positive actions, but we also see some negative reactions as well. By this, I mean that following major incidents, appropriate actions are taken to reduce the risk of reoccurrence. But sometimes we see reactionary responses that will demand immediate and often ill-informed actions. Of course, that's the nature of our democratic system, and I wouldn't have it any other way. In fact, it keeps me employed. but it's not always productive. Now, my first slide lists some basic information on the economic importance of trade on the bay. I won't go through these. I think you're all well aware of the importance of the maritime trade and consequently safe transit in and out of the bay. So instead, I'd like to review some of the major incidents that have occurred in the bay over the last 18 years and look at the policy changes, usually positive, resulting from them. So here I've listed 6 significant incidents that have occurred over this period. This is far from comprehensive, but serves to illustrate the points. I'll start with the Cape Mohican. This was a MARAD vessel, a U.S. vessel, at the San Francisco dry dock in 1996. And due to human error, about 40,000 gallons of fuel oil found its way into the bay. This was probably the first spill in the bay that generated a lot of media and political attention. And there was some friction between the response agencies, the Unified Command, and the city of San Francisco in terms of jurisdiction and lines of authority. This interaction between local government and the Unified Command was further tested with the Costco Busan and is still evolving today. In general, the lessons learned here were largely positive and was in fact partly responsible for the inclusion of dry cargo vessels under the state's regulatory umbrella as opposed to simply tankers. The next incident here, it's quickly I'll go through, is Mundogas Europe and Overseas Cleomar. Far apart in time, but these were both near misses. Mundogas Europe was an anhydrous ammonia tanker, lost steering as it approached the Golden Gate Bridge inbound. The Overseas Cleomar was a tanker in ballast that lost propulsion, leaving the bay just past the Bay Bridge. Now, fortunately for both incidents, quick response by the pilots, followed by rapid assistance from tugs, basically averted a catastrophic situation. But they did lead to several legislative attempts to impose tug escort requirements on any vessel carrying hazardous cargo. Now, these are well-intentioned efforts, but they did not pass into law, and for various reasons, not least of which was that the requirements would essentially apply to every vessel all the way down to sailboats. But it's good to know that tug escorts are appropriate in some situations, and in fact the captain of the port does have broad authority to apply such requirements. And in fact, ammonia tankers have had tug escorts now for many years, and the Coast Guard tracks these hazardous cargo vessels and does apply tug escort orders when it's required. So risk reduction here is being achieved without necessarily having sailboats tethered to tugboats. Next on the list, incident well known to everybody, the elision of the Costco Busan with the Bay Bridge. This was truly a game changer. The physical response was actually viewed as very successful by the spill response community. However, the public and political perception was that the response was a failure. This was a result of many factors, I think, but perhaps most importantly was a lack of sensitivity on behalf of the Unified Command with public perceptions of the response. Now, a lot of reviews of this incident followed and resulted in a lot of good policy changes. For instance, among the Coast Guard's 128 recommendations included the need for improved relations between the UC, Unified Command, and local government, and better media outreach. Spill also resulted in numerous legislative and regulatory proposals. For instance, better coordination and funding of local governments to better involve them in spill response, and also changes to state oversight of pilotage on the bay. And locally, the San Francisco Harbor Safety Committees, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, adopted a number of best management practices, including restrictions to navigation during limited visibility or fog. But the spill also generated immediate calls for actions that were not as well thought out, such as legislation establishing a 2-hour response on the bay. Now, this is an example of an excellent idea with a flawed execution. The legislation would have applied to the entire Bay Area, including areas where ships would never be found. consequently require response resources in those areas as well. That legislation was vetoed, and that was a result criticized by a lot of people in the media and the public. But instead, a better solution was adopted by OSPR through regulation to require the same 2-hour response for those areas in the bay where vessels are found, thus achieving the same goal in a more elegant fashion. So here, significant reform was achieved. I think bad policy was largely avoided. However, we did see some collateral damage in the premature ending of careers at the Coast Guard and OSPR. Moving on here quickly, the Dubai Star. This was a tanker that spilled about 400 gallons of fuel oil in the bay while taking bunkers at Anchorage 9. This spawned legislation for mandatory pre-booming of all oil transfers in California. Now, pre-booming is a good idea, and it's a normal procedure when environmental conditions allow. However, containment boom is really only effective in currents of less than about 1 knot. For those of you familiar with the bay, we see typical currents of about 3 to 5 knots in the central bay, and the use of boom would provide little, if any, benefit. And in fact, the bill would have essentially prohibited bunkering in the bay. That mandatory pre-booming legislation failed, but a different approach was pursued. First, legislation supported by industry expanded the role of inspections from OSPR on fuel transfers, and again, the Harbor Safety Committee stood up and adopted best management practice that go well beyond those of existing state and federal regulations. So together, those efforts, I think, provide real risk reduction while still accommodating commerce on the bay. Finally, we have the Bay Bridge alleged by the overseas Raymar in foggy conditions, a relatively recent event. There was an uproar in the public after it was revealed that the limited visibility restrictions adopted after the Casca Busan did not apply to transit through the Bay Bridge. In fact, there was sound reasoning behind that. Ships underway in the bay might suddenly find themselves in limited visibility and have only one safe harbor, Anchorage, south of the bay. And in order to get there, they have to transit through the bridge. So the alternative would be to start doing circles around the bay, a much worse choice. Nonetheless, a revisiting of that rule was deemed prudent, and the result was to restrict transits departing the South Bay while allowing transits in the other direction. Does this make things safer? Perhaps. I mean, ships not moving pose less risk than ships moving, but they also don't service trade. And this restriction will cause vessel delays. And consider this. The spans on the Bay Bridge are about 2,000 feet wide, and the beam of a typical vessel, a large vessel, is about 150 feet. Most experienced mariners will tell you, off the record, that a ship with modern navigational aid should be able to safely transit that span in zero visibility. So quickly, I'll just sum up here. Every ship move on the bay involves risk, and it's everyone's interest in managing and reducing that risk. Incidents that we have, they do lead to lessons learned and better risk management, but sometimes they can lead to ill-conceived public policy as well. And lastly, I think the most important lesson learned is that we're always learning something new. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. Our next speaker will be Captain Peter McIsaac from San Francisco Bar Pilots.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I am a pilot and president of our association, and I'm going to be fairly brief. Only about 5 minutes of my allotted time. I decided to donate the rest to Mayor Kwan. So, as Tom Amon talked about, during the early days of sail, the pilots would use schooners to race out to the ships, and the first one there would board the ship and provide pilotage. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, within about 3 months, the ship started to arrive in San Francisco. And in fact, they said over the first about 6 months, the population of San Francisco was doubling every week. So there was all sorts of ships coming into the bay. There was no regulated system of pilotage because the state was just barely a state. So in one of the first acts in 1850 of the California legislature that was meeting down at Pueblo de San Jose, they created the State Board of Pilot Commissioners. It recognized the need, the legislature recognized the need of a regulated pilotage system to ensure the safe and efficient movement of commerce into San Francisco Bay. The Port of San Francisco was not established for another 13 years. The early pilots were tasked with protecting the vessel from the environment, namely the fog, the strong currents, the strong winds, heavy seas, and the shallow water. The pilotage grounds of San Francisco Bay are one of the most complex and environmentally sensitive waterways in the world. The challenge for us as pilots is to keep these ports open and accessible day or night in virtually all weather conditions. But it is a balancing act. The Northern California economy depends on the safe or the efficient movement of vessels, but the environment of San Francisco Bay, which is an incredible resource that I think everyone in here loves, depends on our ability to do our job safely and without incident. While we get paid by the ship owners, we actually work for the people of California, hence the name state pilots. Let's talk about accidents. First and foremost, no accident is ever acceptable to our association or the individual pilots that comprise it. But bringing a vessel into port is a complex maneuver that requires everyone involved to execute his or her task in a timely and safe manner. However, the human factor means the potential for human error is always present. When accidents have occurred involving our personnel, a failure to break the error chain is most typically the cause. I believe that most organizations represented here would report the same findings, or at least the honest ones. What is the error chain? It's a concept that many contributing factors lead to an accident rather than one single event. So how do you break the error chain? In our case, we address it through training that should allow the mariner to recognize when a dangerous situation is developing. Recognizing that an error chain is developing can be taught, but knowing how to break the chain takes experience. Sometimes a simple change of course or speed can mitigate the danger. Other times a round turn or stopping the vessel is the answer. Well, let's remember that the ultra-large container vessels and VLCCs are essentially the largest moving things on Earth. Let's talk about the number of major accidents in San Francisco Bay. In 1971, the largest oil spill in Northern California history occurred when two unpiloted oil tankers collided in the Golden Gate. 800,000 gallons of bunker oil spilled into our waters. That accident resulted in legislation implementing the Bridge-to-Bridge Radio Telephone Act and mandating an early VTS type system. The largest dry cargo accident occurred on New Year's Day in 1980 when the unpiloted tug Sentinel departed the safe waters of San Francisco Bay, went out in a gale, towing two very large barges, packed to the gills with break bulk cargo for Hawaii. And they severed the tow line in a heavy swell and lost the barge Kona, which had mainly kind of inert cargo. It was a lot of lumber and paper products. It started heading for the Marin headlands with the southerly wind, and the tug attempted to kind of do round turns and rescue the barge. They ended up severing the tow line of the barge, I forget the name of that barge, a different name, but that barge was loaded with hazmat materials, including 35 fully loaded chlorine canisters, and that ended up on the rocks as well. So what happened then was they had to evacuate a lot of the Marin headlands, and they ended up having to use helicopters to get the chlorine cylinders to safety. Although apparently there was a lot of fishermen very happy because there was cases and cases of beer floating in the bay and free lumber. But anyway, that chlorine could have created a lethal cloud that could have drifted over much of Marin and the Bay Area. In the last 10 years, there have been 86,183 piloted vessel moves. There's been over 100,000 moves since the turn of the century. There have been 2 accidents involving pilots, which I would term as major, the Casco Busan and the Overseas Raymar. Should they have happened? Absolutely not. Did we react as the causal factors of the Casco Busan became known? Yes, we did. Will we react as the causal factors of the Overseas Raymar become known? Yes. And all the stakeholders will react, but let's not overreact and stifle one of the great economic engines in Northern California, and that is the shipping community. At the beginning of my presentation, I said that the early pilots were tasked with protecting the ship from the environment. Well, over the last 30 years, that has come 180 degrees, and it's pretty much spanned my career. A modern pilot and ship master, for that matter, is tasked with protecting the environment from the ship. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Captain Peter. I just would like to remind you, if you have any question, you can write them down on those blue note cards, and the staff will collect them and then hand them to me. Our next speaker will be Commander Jason Tama from U.S. Coast Guard.
Thank you very much. I hope you don't mind if I stand. Us in the military are taught to stand when we're talking to a group. Also, when you have hair like mine, the higher you can get, the better in terms of visibility, especially on camera. It's a pleasure to be here. I thank the coalition. I'd like to recognize one very important Coast Guard person who's in the audience, Captain Greg Stump, who's my boss, is the new captain of the port for Coast Guard Sector San Francisco. He's been here about 3 weeks, and of course will be calling the shots here for the next few years. I know he's really happy to be here, and we'll be happy to meet you on break. And he already told me, after I've been working for him for 3 weeks, that I'm very thorough when I speak, and he challenged whether I'd be able to finish within 10 minutes. So we'll give it a shot, sir. I'm going to talk about 3 things. What makes this area unique from a Coast Guard perspective in terms of preventing accidents? I'm going to talk about how we view the system of prevention, and lastly, a few quick case studies and lessons learned. Well, what makes this place unique? It's the reason we all work here and want to live here, and you've heard many of the things that we've talked about, but we have a dynamic offshore environment, extremely environmentally sensitive. We have a narrow and treacherous bar channel with breaking waves. We have endangered species, whales offshore, which, whether you like it or not, will impact commerce here. They already are impacting commerce. We have the Central Bay with a rocky shoreline, extremely environmentally sensitive areas. We have the San Joaquin and Sacramento River deltas, a completely different environment, all within the same area, all navigable waters, all challenging areas to operate. Then, on top of that, we have 5 to 7 knot currents, which we heard about. We have scores of days of fog. We have winds, any number of other things. That's the Mother Nature piece. What's the human element? We don't lead the country in any real commercial metrics. We know Oakland is number 4 or 5 container port. We know we have 5 refineries here. We're the number 3 ferry passenger vessel operation. We have over 300 ferry transits per day, which gets us over 90,000 ferry transits per year, moving millions of passengers. So we have a lot of everything on the water in a fairly small area, which makes it very exciting for Coast Guard, very challenging, and a great place to be. Not to mention tens of thousands of recreational boaters, America's Cup folks, sailboats, cruise vessels, kiteboards, sailboards, stand-up paddle, anything that floats, people are on it here, even some stuff that doesn't float, unfortunately. Where's my thing? Oh, sorry. Thank you. So let me talk about prevention a little bit. This is how the Coast Guard thinks of prevention in our world. We have 3 portfolios. Inspections. We inspect vessels and facilities for compliance with U.S. regulations and laws and international standards, whether it's double hull, procedures, life-saving, whatever. We have waterways management. You have to have efficient infrastructure to get folks in. You need aids to navigation. You need a vessel traffic system to keep the system orderly and predictable. Most people don't like things necessarily orderly and predictable all the time in your life, but you want it to be very boring, right, Pete? Very boring is good when it comes to vessel traffic management. And then investigations. When things go badly, I can't tell you how important the investigation function is. From the Coast Guard standpoint, it's a safety focus, what happened, and what can we do to prevent it from happening in the beginning, happening again. Now, we're not the only game in town, and I can't put everybody that's involved. This is a layered system of prevention. The Army Corps, who I know you'll be hearing from today, NOAA, who I'm sure is here as well, NTSB, all of these folks play a huge role in maintaining our maritime highways, maintaining our channels, helping us out with the investigations. The state of California, they only get 2 circles here, but probably some of you would think they'd get like 10 of them. But they're involved, heavily involved, protecting their equities, protecting the environment on the inspection side, on the investigation side, certainly on the waterways management side with respect to requiring pilots, mitigating spills, tug escort requirements for tankers, and we work with them very, very closely. And then, of course, the industry itself. The vessel and facility owners and operators who are represented on the panel and in the room today, their insurance underwriters, their classification societies, they have a risk management and risk mitigation function as well, and they're out there doing the job. They have their own audit programs, their own inspection programs, of course, their own training programs to make sure that they're operating safely. And you could certainly add overlaps from the industry side to other elements here. And then, of course, the vessel flag state. These are foreign flag vessels for the most part coming into our ports. There's quite a bit of U.S. flag trade, but we have to work very closely with the foreign flag states that are inspecting and certifying these vessels to international standards. So that's the layered system. Now, there's also something called the Harbor Safety Committee, and many of you here have attended those meetings. This is a monthly gathering that really crosses all jurisdictional and regulatory boundaries, also brings in folks like the fishing vessel community, the recreational vessel community, environmental interests, and they come and they sit together once a month here. And if you haven't been to one of these meetings, you should come. It's a very robust group, and they can get things done that no single agency or entity could ever do. And they do that through developing best practices and guidelines. And these are not just guidelines that go into a binder that is a nice thing to look at on the shelf. This Harbor Safety Committee develops meaningful, substantive guidelines that are followed and implemented by the pilots, by the shipping companies, to help keep everybody safe. And they can do it typically a lot faster and a lot less painfully than any regulatory body could do. So let's talk about a few incidents. And we talked about some of these already, so I won't spend too much time. And I know the pictures are a little bit small for somebody in the back. But I want to focus on the top. You know, the Coast Guard has four main mission areas, and we're very proud of them. And it's safety, security, environmental protection, which everybody gets, and facilitating commerce. And these things, as you can imagine, are not always complementary, and sometimes they're in tension, as many of you know. But this facilitation commerce piece, which I know is very appropriate for this group, is something that we take very seriously. And we're very sensitive about any regulatory action we take. Captain Stump has a tremendous amount of authority here over any vessel or facility action here, an unbelievable amount of authority. Any of the lawyers in the room will attest to that. In fact, there's a guy, one of our local agents, who calls the captain of the port the 800-pound gorilla, and gave the last captain of the port an actual 800-pound gorilla for her to take when she departed. But we appreciate balance and try to use our authority sparingly. We talked about the Costco Busan, an absolutely terrible incident in an environment where there's zero public and political tolerance for failure. This was an example of external forces taking control of the situation and dictating some of the response. However, the Harbor Safety Committee came together and developed very meaningful, critical maneuvering areas that have been followed since that incident, literally 100%. Now, will there be some tweaks to that after the overseas Raymar? There may, and in fact, the Harbor Safety Committee came together and implemented within a month of the overseas Raymar some temporary safety guidelines to limit transits through the Bay Bridge under certain visibility conditions while the investigations are being completed. So again, an example of the HSC coming together very quickly to take some swift action. I want to talk a little bit about fuel switching. The state of California implemented low sulfur fuel requirements in 2009. After 2009, after that implementation, we saw a huge spike in vessels losing propulsion, meaning the engine stopped working, the propeller stopped turning, associated with switching fuel. This is a more delicate, lighter fuel that requires careful management on the ship, careful procedures for temperature and viscosity control, and you have to do it right. And we saw a lot of ships in that transition didn't quite figure that out. We also saw ships changing their routing dramatically because this fuel is more expensive. So they don't want to be within 24 miles of California's shoreline. And I point this out because this regulation no doubt has substantial air quality improvements, but there are secondary and tertiary effects that impact risk with any action you take. And the last thing I'll mention is ULCVs, ultra-large container vessels. We saw, this is a picture of the MSC Fabiola in the turning basin right over here. At the time, largest container ship ever to call in North America, 1,200 foot in a 1,500 foot turning basin. 20, 30 years ago, nobody might have said, is the turning basin big enough? Are our bridges tall enough? Those are the discussions that are happening now. The Port of Oakland did a number of studies, worked closely with the pilots, actual simulations at the CMA, worked closely with the Coast Guard to develop a protocol to bring these ships in safely, and they're calling on a regular basis. Those discussions are happening at ports all around the country, and we're leveraging technology everywhere to see what we can do to bring these ships in. And this is really the last one. New Carissa, dramatic, horrible imagery. This was an incident in Oregon. It's just a reminder we have hundreds of miles of remote coastline here in California that can be exposed. An incident like this would be a disaster. If you can imagine a picture like that on the Mendocino coast or Big Sur or anywhere else. Fortunately, we have a great group of people here. There are tugboat operators. You see them pushing and pulling ships when they come in. They're also the folks we call to rescue these ships offshore, and we've had a number of these recently. So constantly challenges for the Coast Guard, constantly trying to balance all these forces, and that's what keeps it really fun, and I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jason. Our last speaker, and certainly not the least, is Yvonne Addassi from Office of Spill Prevention and Response.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay. So one of the best things about going last is that you get to revise your presentation on the spot, right? And for those of you who know me, know that brevity is not my long suit, so I will indeed try and stay in the 10 minutes and hopefully try and make up a little time. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to focus on the question of, are we doing enough to protect the Bay? Because that was one of the things that the panel was asked to look at. So let's see how we go here. So just a quick background and introduction. You're going to hear me say OSPR, which is the Office of Spill Prevention and Response. It's a lot of words, so you'll just hear me say OSPR. Is a one-stop shop from a state perspective of marine oil spills. And when I had one of my staff reviewing my presentation, he said, well, you know, Yvonne, these folks are going to say it's a one-stop shop that they never want to have to go to. Okay, so we are mindful of that. And what that means is that the administrator of OSPR, who we are very fortunate to have him with us today, Tom Cullen over in the corner, retired captain from the Coast Guard, has broad authority. It's probably it's the only state agency in the nation, and probably the only one of its kind where from beginning to end, preparedness, readiness, prevention, drills and exercises, actual response, natural resource damage assessment, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, and trustee agency is all in one group, okay? Which we always heard, you know, if you come onto a vessel and there's one vessel that has 5 captains and one vessel that has 1 captain, which vessel are you gonna wanna go on? Okay, and so in that same analogy, OSPR has 1 captain. So those decisions are all made within that rubric. Another thing that's very critical when you think about it from a state perspective is that we have a standard written in our statute for best achievable protection, okay? And if you think, and so my remarks are gonna be around how it is that OSPR tries to grapple with what that really means in daily life. And if you think about it, it's not so different from the question that we are asking, are we doing enough? So the way that we would translate that is, are we meeting best achievable protection? I think it kind of goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that before a spill, pretty much everybody in this room is on the same page, right? Prevention, prevention, prevention. Keep the black stuff from hitting the blue stuff, okay? We also know that once a spill does happen, we all have our lenses in which we look at that response, right? A ship owner, the captain, Coast Guard, bar pilots, everybody has a different perspective from which they look at it. But I think that we also have an overriding perspective as well, and that is that we want the environment to be as whole as possible. And I don't just mean the ecological environment, I mean the economic environment as well. So it's a constant balancing act no matter what perspective you come to it from. And my focus for the presentation today, again, is going to be on prevention measures. I need one more hand. Maybe you can do that. That'd be great. So, next slide. Current prevention measures. I'm going to look at the Bay specifically. And when OSPR first started in 1990, it was a result of legislation after the Exxon Valdez and here in California, the American trader spill. One of the first questions that was asked is, what are the routes that vessels take to come in? And specifically, what are TAPS trade vessels doing? So vessels that are bringing oil in from Alaska into California. And if one of those vessels lost propulsion or had a casualty for whatever reason, how long would it take for those vessels to hit shore? And based on some of those early studies, there was a gentleman's agreement, which is still in place today, that keeps those TAPS trade vessels, any tank vessels, not barges obviously, 50 miles offshore until they make the right-hand or left-hand turn into the coast. So you can see already that gives you a huge level of protection, if not safety, before a vessel, if something happens with a vessel next. So you heard Jason talk a fair amount about harbor safety committees as well as John. I guess this is sort of the plug for OSPR, is that that's actually written into our statute. OSPR is the statutory requirements that allows and requires harbor safety committees in 7 different places, I think 5, I have to count, up and down the coast. And so here in San Francisco Bay, that means that all tank vessels are required to have tug escorts. Now, some tank vessels, if they show redundancy in propulsion and steerage, could petition to not go under tug escort, but currently, even though there are vessels that do have that redundancy, they continue to go in under tug escorts. And Jason talked about this as well, and in preparing for my talk, for those of you who know Ted Marr, he is the head of our prevention section within OSPR. One of the things that he said that was most important about the harbor safety committees is that they have broad authority to make recommendations to the OSPR, to Coast Guard, to the entire industry. And it's one of those places where people get together where they normally wouldn't get together, from fishing industry, from bar pilots, from trustee agencies, et cetera. And they come up with best practices. What I kind of talk about in terms of, and Jason talked about this as well, is the safety net. You know, one of the things that we look at when we look at prevention is the training of the captain, the training of the crew, what the vessel actually looked like. Is it single hull? Is it double hull? When they start coming in, they're 50 miles offshore. All those things taken in total provide a safety net. So one thing can go wrong and you might not get a spill. 2 things can go wrong, you still might not get a spill. And so over time, we hope that that means that the number of spills goes down and down. Next. One thing that came after Costco Busan, and I can't remember who talked about it, might have been John, our bunkering and lightering monitoring program. And that is being implemented statewide. It is monitoring of bunkers specifically and taking a look at, it's supposed to be a risk-based program. But one of the other things that it's more than just monitoring. Our folks are working currently with the harbor safety committees to come up with best bunkering practices. That's not just what goes on here in California, but if there's best bunkering practices in Washington or Alaska or even on the East Coast, what that would mean for us here. And we've had some success with that, which is always great. We always love to talk about success. And that is, in the last 2 years, we have had no spill of oil from a bunkering accident in San Francisco Bay. Now, we have had a release of oil on the deck. But again, there's that safety net, right? They were able to keep it on the deck so that it actually didn't reach the water. Next. And it wasn't, Jason talked about this just slightly, but as you see the makeup of the panel, you're looking primarily at oil that's coming into the bay via vessels, okay? But I think that we all acknowledge that there are also shoreside threats as well. There's pipelines, there's facilities, and something that would happen at any of those could definitely impact what happens in the bay. You know, if we had a release at a shoreside facility at Vallejo or Benicia or Richmond, that could easily change vessel traffic. It could do any of a number of other things. So that's, and OSPR also has prevention measures in that arena as well. I just won't be talking about them much. Next slide. So this is sort of my closing slide. And that is one of the things that Tom and I talk about a fair amount, also with our branch chiefs, is if we were to lean forward and say, what is it that we need to do to poise ourselves, not just now, but in the future, of what best achievable protection really means? Because it's not like it's a destination, right? It's not like all of a sudden you're there and you get to shake hands and go home and isn't life great? It's not static. It's ever moving. And so as a regulatory agency, we are responsible for understanding those changes in the industry. You know, where oil is actually moving. Is it moving more offshore, onshore? Is it pipeline? Is it here? What risks are changed now that we have very large capacity vessels or ultra large capacity vessels? What does that look like next? Oh my gosh, I didn't make up any time at all. So I also think that we as a regulatory agency, as well as the folks in this room, is that we need to shift from preventing the last big event, right? Anybody who's traveled on planes lately have to take off your shoes. And that's because somebody tried to put incendiary devices in their shoes, right? Well, we need to not fall into that trap as well. We need to not be continually planning for the next Casca Busan. We need to be planning for where the risks take us. And what does that look like a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And if you, 30 seconds. So there's the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council are taking a look at what they're calling the safety culture, okay? And that is, what does a safety culture look like in industry? What would the safety culture look like for regulatory agencies? And how do we work together to bring that up for an entire industry? And that goes back to best achievable protection. So this is my final statement. As a trustee agency, our first responsibility is to the public and managing those trust resources on their behalf. But our second responsibility is in working on that first responsibility, that we are true, honest brokers with our industry counterparts, that we do things in an honest and an even-handed way, and that anything that we take on provides a level of environmental protection, but also does not adversely impact the people of the state. And I think that that's something, whether you come from the regulatory side or the bar pilot side or the industry side, that's something that we can all agree to, and something I hope we can all work together in the future. And I'm done.
Well, thank you, Yvonne. We have received, I think, 3 questions. I would like to start with the first question. It said, based on your experience, do you think Bay Area news media organization sensationalize and are quick to ascribe blame following a collision or spill on the bay, or are they fair and balanced and do a good job informing the public?
Yes, is the answer to that question. Not all reporters are fungible, right? Some really want to get the information correct. Some want to get the information out. I shouldn't just say reporters, but everybody has their point of view. I think that one thing, as Wildlife Branch Director during Casca Busan, I often got asked in the middle of the response, who's to blame? How are we going to deal with this? And my answer was constantly, you know, right now we are in the middle of response. We have plenty of time to point fingers later. We have plenty of time under the investigation. But right now, our job is to get this oil cleaned up in the most efficient and effective way. And to the extent that you can help us do that, by telling the public what they can do, what is helpful, where they can go to get information. I think that that's important. The other thing that we learned since Costco Busan is that we are no longer on that print video news cycle, right? We're on a 24-hour news cycle. And so the unified command has to be able to address the information needs of that 24-hour news cycle, because if we don't provide them with accurate information, they're going to find information somewhere, whether it's accurate or not.
Thank you, Yvonne. I have a question that is addressed to all panelists. What effort has the Harbor Safety Committee, bar pilots, U.S. Coast Guard made to educate Congress on the relationship between improving safety based on dredging, shipping channels, and improving navigation performance by channel dipping? Repeat the question one more time. Well, the question said, what effort has the Harbor Safety Committee, bar pilots, PMSA, U.S. Coast Guard made to educate Congress on the relationships between improving safety based on dredging shipping channels and improving navigation performance by channel deepening?
I'll take a stab at it. I think, I can't speak for the other organizations, but I know that there is a big effort amongst the Army Corps, the various ports, specifically the Port of Stockton, Contra Costa County, to promote the deepening of the Bay to Stockton ship channel in such a way as to allow larger ships to safely navigate through the various key points along those ways, and to get commodities in and out of Stockton, as well as to allow tankers to safely make it to the refineries that are past the Pinole Shoals. And so there is an effort along those ways. Each of those organizations, each of the organizations will have some input into the approval process that the Corps is undergoing to find out whether or not that can be achieved and whether we can actually deepen that channel. But there is a goal, both in terms of realignment of the northern channel as well as the actual deepening project, to improve safety by making it easier for these ships to transport their cargo. So, yeah. John.
Yeah, and if I could just add, a lot of this is about money. And I think virtually every organization listed, and a lot of other ones, for instance, CMANC, Jim Hausner in the audience, has done a lot of efforts, state resolutions, letters, lobbying in Congress to get that money. It's an ongoing effort, and it's just something we continually fight with.
Well, thank you, Guy, John, Peter, James, and Yvonne. I think our time is up. I would like to thank the audience. For your engagement, and we're sorry we can get to all of the questions. And thank you, and enjoy our next session that will begin at 10:45. Thank you.